This is a tutorial on the seller license to remain in possession addendum, commonly referred to as the SIP or the SIP form because it's car form SIP. Now, this is for seller leasebacks or seller rentbacks or just the seller remaining in possession for no money up to 29 days. If the seller is going to stay in possession after closing for 30 or more days, you'll want to use the residential lease after sale form. It even mentions it right here, RLAS. That's the CAR form. And that's because it's a little bit more comprehensive. This is the shortest version. This is just it's 2 pages. It's a very short form. And then the residential lease after sale for 30 days or more is a little bit longer. And then if you're doing like a year-long lease, you should really use the normal lease agreement. But we'll just look at the SIP form, and we'll go through it very quickly here as it's short. And I'll give you a little tip on it, a little pro tip. But we start here. Now, by default, this amends the purchase agreement. So if you didn't check any boxes, it automatically is assumed to be incorporated into the transaction. Now, that said, you do want to allude to the existence of this form on a RPA, a purchase agreement. You don't just want to include this with an offer or include this with a counter. You want to write in on a counter or a purchase agreement that this form exists. And you can just put something like car form SIP dated, whatever the date is hereby incorporated into this agreement, or something to that effect. You basically want to say this form is incorporated into the agreement. So if someone saw a purchase agreement, they'd know that out there exists this form. All right, so moving along, we put the property address here, the names of the parties, very simple. It tells you about how this is intended for up to 29 days. Now there's a term, and you can put how many days after close of escrow. You put a numerical amount here, or you can put a definitive calendar date here and then time of day, by default at 6 p.m. unless you want to change it. And that's it. This is the term. This is how many days the seller is staying in. Now consideration, what's the seller paying? Now, because this is such an extreme seller's market, I'm seeing a lot of times there's nothing put in here. And actually, I'm not sure if zip forms will let you put 0 in here. You probably check a box and write something. I think I've seen people put 1 cent, but the idea is that a lot of sellers have been getting away with staying in possession and paying nothing. But if you are going to pay something, you can put a per diem here, or you can put a flat fee dollar amount here. And it says that those funds are to be taken from escrow. So it's incorporated into the accounting escrow does in the transaction. And it says if the seller vacates prior to the end of the term, then there's not going to be any refund, because many times sellers vacate. They just leave before the end of the term of remaining in possession. And then there's a late charge. Now, we're going to go down here, and actually, I should mention one other thing too. The seller is still obligated to give keys to the buyer. I just want to throw that out there because this has come up on calls I've been on where the seller thinks that the buyer can just wait and that the seller is basically still the boss. Well, it's not that simple. The seller is a tenant, the buyer is a landlord, the buyer needs keys, the buyer needs control, the buyer needs access. There are still laws that exist in California that allow a buyer to do an inspection with a 48-hour notice or to enter the premises with a 24-hour notice. But short of it is make sure that your client, the buyer, is getting their garage clicker or keys or whatever they need or additional copies of it when escrow closes. All right. Now, I think there should always be a deposit because the seller could easily damage the property on the way out. Or let me phrase it like this. At what point should a landlord not get a deposit from a tenant? Doesn't that sound silly? A tenant can damage property. Anything can go wrong on the behalf of the tenant, and the landlord incur the cost. So you should have a deposit. Well, a lot of times people leave this empty here. They don't put a deposit. And I think you should not only put a deposit there. So you can have it released to the buyer, which is what I recommend. Some people check held in escrow. I think that's silly. That fee should be held in by the buyer as a landlord deposit, and then returned to the seller once the buyer takes possession. So put that here, that amount here, and then leave this. Now, if someone checks this box, there should be instructions on what to do if the parties don't agree to the release of the deposit. Because what happens is that money gets stuck in escrow. Escrow needs both parties' signatures to release a deposit. So if you put, $5,000 or $10,000 as a deposit, and it's held in escrow, and the landlord, the buyer / landlord, says, "Oh, the seller / tenant damaged a door that cost $1,500 to repair. I need that money." Well, that seller / tenant can say, no, we didn't. It was like that anyway. And you can't get that money out of escrow. It's stuck there unless both parties agree. So it's better to be in the possession of the buyer / landlord. Utilities really should stay in the name of the seller. And there's lines for exceptions here. And then there's some verbiage about entry, keys, same thing I already talked about before. Real simple. That's really all you need to know. You sign it, and then you're done. That's it. Just make sure that when you fill this form out, you allude to the existence of this form in writing on a counteroffer or the RPA with verbiage like seller in possession form dated blank or car form SIP dated blank is hereby incorporated into this agreement. And that's it. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. Thank you.